First of all, I'd just like to ask all my panellists to introduce themselves. Dan, we've already covered you, I think, so I'll skip on Sam, please.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. My name is Sam Langsford. I'm the Global Treasury Inbound Payment Specialist for INGKA Global Treasury, and that you may better know as IKEA.
Thank you. Stephen.
Great. Steve King, I lead Sustainability Solutions for Visa, a new group that started last January, so a year and a bit ago.
Hi, I'm Chris, CEO and founder of Receiptable, with a very simple mission to eradicate paper receipts from the world. Thank you to Dan, who has already gone through why we do that, and we do it in a very simple way by simply pairing your credit or debit card to our service or to your banking app, and the next time you go to make a payment in a participating retailer, you get a digital receipt by magic, and we give the printer a break.
Thank you. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. So what I'd like to do first is just to take this back a little bit and cover a little bit more of the context of why we're even speaking about this particular topic. So I want to start by exploring what do we mean by sustainability. I think sometimes the term's mixed up with quite a few other things. We know that it's also about the environment and carbon emissions and so on, but I'd like to really dig into that a little bit. And then also just a bit more detail on how payments can intersect with this sustainability agenda and influence the broader impact of those initiatives. So Steve, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thanks for the presentation before, laying the scene for us. I often use Mark Carney to quote to get started on this topic, where he talks about the size of change that we're about to experience is about the size of the Industrial Revolution at the speed of the digital revolution. And within that, a huge amount of disruption, huge amount of economic shift. We're seeing quite a few different parts of the economy shift, whether it's regulators, capital markets, or civil society, all start to move together, and sometimes not always together. And that's creating opportunities, really. From a consumer standpoint, it seems that they, particularly post-pandemic, are really looking for ways to shop their values more, equate their climate awareness that came through so, I guess, so strongly through that period of time, and what they're shopping and what they're doing with their money. And that's going to show up in a bunch of ways. We've heard about carbon before, but I think that's going to show up in a number of different ways. On the merchant, or as you're often like to call yourself, business side, you are facing, as we talked about before, regulation and the cost of that, and maybe potentially the opportunity in that in terms of cost of capital is going to shift your business, and the potential to possibly differentiate yourself and seek some of those consumers, those citizens that are looking for more sustainable options. And so at that marriage of maybe, my mic keep going in and out, of supply and demand between the consumer coming up and the business trying to meet them, we think there's just an incredible amount of opportunity to shift and to move where it's going. And at Visa, we think there's a role to be able to accelerate the shift that is happening and wants to happen. And often I think amazing that we're in a digital environment to do this. It's not cash and face-to-face anymore. And all the opportunities that then show up, particularly in somewhere, a setting like this, in this entire ecosystem, and what can we be doing? Maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That was very comprehensive. Dan, do you have anything to add on that particular point?
Yeah, I think just for me, the most exciting thing is just the ubiquity and the reach of payments. And around that, it's also the emotions and the relationships as well. You know, people trust brands, and they're interested in brands, and they're invested in brands. And I think that it's those relationships and those bonds that can actually help to drive consumers to behave more sustainably. If they see it, you know, performed and acted out by a brand that they love and trust, such as IKEA through INGKA, that will encourage them actually to live by the values of those brands and to change their behavior themselves as well. So I think that, you know, payments is the rails that can drive this, but it's the emotions and the relationships built on top of that that have the power and the reach to create that sort of, industrial revolution at speed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Dan touched on earlier about the power of data in helping to drive better choices, sustainable choices at different levels, and particularly at a consumer level. But what about for merchants? How can they embrace more sustainable initiatives? Where do they start? What kind of things can they think about implementing? And Sam, since you're from the merchant side, I think it would be good if we start with you, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's helpful that Dan name-checked me there, because what we really want to point out is that IKEA does have sustainability already as a very solid cornerstone of everything it does. And I think you can read about this in the sustainability report for the financial year 2022 that we just released, touching on all aspects of ESG. And people generally know that that's something that IKEA stands for. The features of this report, what we're trying to do is it's achieved by measuring, understanding, and communicating to the consumer everything about sustainability that our business value chain touches. And we can do that very easily with products. We understand how they're made, we understand how they're shipped, we understand the carbon footprint of doing that, we understand the carbon footprint of a customer using the product. But when it comes to payments, that's not so easy. And it's nonetheless part of our value chain. And for something like IKEA, and I'm sure this is true of any other merchant who's got ambitions in this area, I think that's a great missed opportunity, because consumers at IKEA and many others do have choice when it comes to payments, but we can't inform them of the sustainability impact of one choice relative to another. And it also would have given us the opportunity to talk more openly about our credentials in the rest of the ESG space that we're very proud of. And I think it's something to shout about if we could achieve that more with the data that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that that's even difficult for such a large retailer, and then for smaller merchants, another challenge yet again, I think. Chris, you work particularly with merchants, and you provide a solution that does help them with this. So maybe we could just dig into that a little as well.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, we've got a huge amount of power locked up within payments networks, and we can actually help consumers to make some really simple but really, really small and frictionless choices in the way they change their behavior that actually makes a real impact. One of the things that was called out in the presentation earlier, and what we're doing with Receiptable, is surfing on the move to digital receipts, and we've got a lot of legislation that is helping consumers to do that and forcing merchants to think about the way they issue a receipt. Some sad news, unfortunately, Dan had just shown that France was leading the charge in making that simple change for consumers, but unfortunately, the news hot off the press this week is, for the second time, that piece of legislation has been pushed back. So supposed to be coming in on the 1st of April. We're now talking about maybe September or maybe December. Why is that? The government have come out and said, in a time of reduced spending power for consumers, actually they think consumers still really need to have a big piece of paper to be able to review their spend. It's a slightly thinly veiled excuse for none of the major merchants in France were really ready at a technical level to implement the changes. So that's a real shame. And I've heard on the grapevine that the EU are very much looking to what's going on in France with their sustainability programme and anti-waste law to look at having an EU-wide rollout of that. So unfortunately, watch this space on that front.
I think the regulation piece is interesting because, as anyone that's been in the payment space for a while knows, the implementing organisations not being ready for the enforcement of regulation is pretty standard, and so a lot of these delays. But I think it's really good that we're actually starting to even make those regulations. And the other thing that we know is, often when there's a regulation coming in one place, it's the place that leads the way, and it comes in more broadly. So that one of the things I was going to ask you all about was what are the imperatives for change? But I think we've covered some of that, being the consumer, the regulation, differentiation from So we're going to flip it around and just look at what the barriers are. So we touched a little bit on that with looking at, how do merchants get hold of data. But Stephen, you work with lots of different organisations and merchants. So what are the kind of considerations that they need to think about, and what at a merchant level do they need to be aware of when they're starting to look at sustainability?
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's motivators that break down barriers, maybe, as well as the barriers themselves, because those are usually fairly easy, right? With acceptance of change or cost or what it might be. I think for the medium, large merchants, as was discussed before, there isn't much choice now. They have to do the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and that's driving a certain amount of predicted cost or future cost that you can prepare for, and you can understand then what to do. It seems like a small step, but it's every single person that we talk to, as soon as you do that first step, you get such a larger view of what my business is actually doing and where my costs are. And so a lot of climate change is linked to higher costs. In the last 9 months, we've all seen increased energy prices, increased food prices, some obviously to do with the war in Ukraine, but a lot to do with just how much the fuel has gone up in terms of price in the energy transition. So spotting those things early in terms of where am I exposed to climate, where am I exposed to carbon, is usually a pretty good predictor of where I'm going to be exposed to cost in the future. And that's usually a pretty good motivator to drive some sort of change. Often that means financing, though, or some way to get the money. And it brings you back to either a bank or somewhere in order to do that transition together. So that's cost is probably the big one. The other one is it does seem like there's opportunities for, I'll call them merchants, but business sectors to move together and learn from each other. And so IKEA does a great job within I'll say the furniture business. You probably have a better description of what you guys do, but there's within clothing, within auto manufacturers, you can sort of see where the North Stars are and where we can sort of borrow from each other, which is a much more open practice, I think, when it comes to sustainability than it does to other types of competitive information.
Thank you. Sam, I'm going to come back to you to see if you can talk a little bit more through that.
Yeah, I think I can really totally just endorse what Steve's just said, because firstly, cost is absolutely a factor. There's not really much out there that isn't having cost as a factor. But then when it comes to the solution, I think you've hit the nail on the head as well. So when you talk about barriers from an INGKA perspective, Dan mentioned the CSRD directives that are coming. IKEA is already committing itself to things like climate positivity as a business for all our interactions by 2030, and net zero emissions across our value chain by 2050. That's already a commitment from INGKA. So we're experiencing some of those barriers already that we're trying to build the reporting for those commitments. And that involves, as I said before, measuring, understanding, and communicating all elements of our value chain. The scope 3 emissions that actually includes payments. There's no way around it. We have to report on this at some stage in the future. And the fact that reporting and understanding the emissions from payments is so difficult, it could be a problem for merchants in the future. Even some, like you said, as big as INGKA is having difficulty in this area. So cooperation is going to really be the key. Dan's slide earlier that showed the breakup of the DNB assessment of a carbon footprint of a payment, that's the starting point. But we know, again, customers have a choice. There's lots of different types of customers, and a solid figure for every payment isn't going to do it justice. We need to be able to understand all of the different compositions of the payments so that we can move the needle in lots of different places. So we have the acquirers, the issuers, the networks, the payment orchestrators, the PSPs, the hardware that you mentioned in the graph. Those have all got emissions and impact that we're going to have to report, and we're only going to achieve that by working together. But the flip side of that is that barrier is also a benefit to us in the future, because, as you also said, the reach is so enormous. The more parties you add, the more people you connect with. It's something that's so engaging towards the customer because they're actually there in front of us, in front of our payment point or in front of our website, and that it's a really good way of connecting with them to make meaningful change if we can find a way to communicate together and coordinate the entire chain of service.
So there's a real opportunity there because the merchants have that trusted relationship with their consumers, and there's the opportunity to educate. But the merchants themselves will need help to get there and deliver what they need to. Thank you. I want to pick up on that message of collaboration and cooperation in a minute, but just before that, I'd like to expand a little bit on some of the examples. So Dan, you shared some examples earlier of particular businesses that are, doing some great initiatives around sustainability. Are there any particular sectors or segments or individual businesses that you think are really leading the charge in this area?
I just need to check my microphone works. It's slipping off my massive head. Let's see that. I hope you can hear me. I think some of the examples that I showed were attempting to find something happening at merchant level, something happening at sort of payment processor level as well, and something happening at card level as well with the G&D thing that they did with Parley for the oceans. I think ultimately everyone bears some responsibility to take some kind of action in the value chain or in the ecosystem. There's always something that we can do. For me, the projects that really ignite my support and my passion are not those that attempt to do anything that's kind of offsetting or compensating. It's just driving additional impact, whether that's impact on climate, whether that's impact on communities, whether that's impact on the social fabric. I think those are the more impressive and interesting things. It's taking action rather than just performing some kind of accounting process. Because it's action that results in actual change on the ground as well. That's where you see positive impacts. And the idea really being that those companies that have the biggest reach create a rising tide that lifts all the boats. And I really think that that's something that we can do together in terms of cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Chris, you work with a lot of merchants and other providers. Do you have some areas you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think we really have to look to ultra high volume sectors and individual merchants to trigger huge change and really sort of plant those seeds in the consumer's mind. To make things a little interactive, maybe you can raise your hand if you have taken an Uber to get to the show or from the airport, or maybe in the last week. Well, I'll participate too. So hands up if you've taken an Uber recently. Okay, so keep your hands up, and now keep it up if you used the Uber Green option. Okay, few hands down. Okay, not great. Second quick poll, hands up if you flew to the event. Don't worry, we're not the sustainability police. We can't all ride our bike here, right? Okay, so plenty of flights. Now again, keep your hands up if at the end of the payment journey, if your PA didn't book the flight for you, if at the end of a journey you used a carbon offsetting option for that flight.
But not the airlines, I used ours.
Not so many, but a significantly larger volume of the audience chose the Uber Green option versus the offsetting of their flight. Now, why is that? I think Uber are doing great work on that front in that they put Uber Green really front and center to the consumer. It is the default option, and they normally make it cheaper. Versus the airlines who really bury it as an option right at the end of the payment journey, or worse still, post-payment for the consumer. That is changing. Some of you may well have taken Lufthansa to get here. What Lufthansa now offer you when you're choosing your flight, so you've got your really, really cheap eco right up to your expensive flex ticket, and they now default to a pricing option that includes a carbon offsetting within it in a very similar way to what Uber Green do with Uber Green. So I think the a point I'm getting around to is, where do you put the choices along the payment chain for your consumer? And I think we see a lot greater impact when it is right at the start of the journey and we're encouraging you to make that choice rather than burying it at the end almost as an afterthought.
It's interesting because I think in the Uber example, it's much more obvious, but potentially when you're booking a flight, maybe merchants are not making those options obvious, even if they do have them. So it's about careful thought of that customer journey as well, isn't it? So the last thing I want to do before we move on to the questions, which I'm glad to see we've got a few coming through, is there's probably a lot of PSPs and acquirers, payment service providers of various kinds in this room. We've talked about this idea of collaboration, cooperation is probably the only way that we're really going to tap into the opportunities to move the dial on sustainability within this industry. So, each of the panelists, can you give your piece of advice or one principle that you would like to give as a call to action to the audience today to take away? Dan, I'm going to start with you.
I think that, for me, focuses on the first part of the presentation I gave earlier, which is kind of get your own house in order first. Because if you do that and you're open and transparent about it, it makes it so much easier then to share that initiative with others. It makes it easier to have the second conversation, which is, why should you do something about it? You can't sit there and not take action yourself, but tell everybody else to take action. You kind of have to practice what you preach. So I think take action yourself is the first thing to do.
So we will lead by example.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I think it's far be it for me to repeat directly what Dan said, but I wholeheartedly agree. So we at IKEA have some power in our hands to some extent. We get to choose which suppliers we work with. We have some criteria for ESG-related matters on measurements that exist out there, but they're not universally available. They're not specifically focused on the service of the company that you're going to buy. They're focused on the whole company themselves, so it's somewhat limited. But there are organizations that are out there that we connect with. CDP Disclosure, for example, which IKEA is listed in. Science-Based Targets Initiative, which also we're listed in. So if a PSP or an acquirer is completely stuck for where to start, there are places out there that can offer some kind of benchmarking or some kind of support to understand how you measure yourself a bit better and get your own house in order. So that would be the first place to start. But if I'm being a bit selfish and greedy, what we really want is for suppliers to come to us and say, we've measured this, we understand this, here's this data for you to communicate to your customers. So that's our wish, and I hope a little bit of background on where they might be able to start.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, having come from, I guess, a combo or a trio of banking, innovation, and sustainability, it feels like there's opportunities everywhere. Whether it's in the data, whether it's at the point of sale or after the point of sale or on the terminal, whether it's in reporting and transferring that information back through to the end consumer. It sort of goes on and on and on, I think, in terms of the number of places. If the business can turn and see it as a business in sustainability rather than something to fear, it does feel like there's an incredible number of opportunities to drive revenue and switch what you're doing. Your examples on the airline and then the Uber, I'm always amazed by the delivery one where you choose, packages together or separate. Within that is sustainability, interestingly, and one of the big trends we're seeing, I think, in the solutions is solutions without the sacrifice. So how can more and more things come across to the consumer? They don't have to be labeled green in order for it to drive cost changes or benefits to your business, and for then the consumer to benefit as well. We might be in that next era of making more and more of this stuff, I think, quite frictionless, and the more sustainable choice, the word you used before. So yeah, more and more, I think, because that generation, Gen Z, Gen A eventually, I guess is where we'll go after that. They're seeking this out, and that's where a lot of the profit pools are and a lot of the, your future customers. And they are green all over. If you go to the US, it's one of the only things almost that's bipartisan, is being green.
Excellent, Chris.
Always difficult going last
It
with
is,
such
sorry
a
about
knowledgeable
that.
panel. I think to echo what's already been said, if you're a merchant, it's extremely difficult to look all the way down the chain of how you operate your payments and look to optimize and make more sustainable a lot of things that are out of your hands. So I think if I was going to come back to the question of what advice would I give is look all the way down that chain and pick out the simplest things that you can change and try to offer your consumers, your customers, the things that require the least effort. You know, a lot of us are in the business of making checkouts as fast as possible and trying to reduce friction, trying to make our consumers' lives as easy as possible. I think they're the ones to go for now, is where can you really look to make one very simple change consumer side that actually has big impact, and to come right the way back to the start of Dan's presentation, to imagine that pyramid going down. So if you're fairly near the top of that pyramid, what's that one little change that you can make that gets mass uptake from consumers?
Thank you. I think that ties in very well with this solution without sacrifice idea, you know, making it easier for the consumer to make better choices. Thank you. I think we'll move on to the questions. If I could have them back up on the screen, please. Okay, we'll go from
Everyone else can read them.
Oh, there
Yeah.
we go. Okay, so I really like this first one. Do you think it should be the consumer's responsibility to donate towards offsetting CO2 emissions? No one ever requested this when they drove to the shopping centre to purchase at a physical store. That is a very fine point. Obviously, we mentioned that a lot of this now is possible because we're in a digital environment. And small things like moving away from paper receipts helps. Who would like to answer the question about whether it's the consumer's responsibility?
I'm happy to have a
Dan.
crack at it. You know, ultimately, it is somebody's responsibility to reduce the CO2 impact of everything we do. And we do a lot of extractive activity as a civilization that pulls fossil fuels out of the ground. And we're not just doing that for fun. We're not just spraying them on the desert and enjoying ourselves. We're using them to manufacture our clothes, to manufacture our electronics, to be able to travel. It's a fundament of our entire economy. When you sort of look then down the value chain, the whole reason the top exists is because the bottom wants it. So the concept of polluter pays eventually comes down to the consumer. And the difficulty comes when it comes to something like offsetting is whether you feel you would like to really expose that responsibility to the consumer. Because there are other things that you could say the consumer is responsible for as well, such as buying clothes at a price point that means they're probably manufactured by children. That's awful, you know, but it's another thing that the consumer needs to be aware of. So I think putting this front of center at the point of sale surfaces the issue to the consumer. It's the choice of the merchant whether they put that piece of friction in there or not, or whether they take responsibility on behalf of the consumer. One of the things that delighted me recently, and it probably delighted me mainly because I'm into sustainability as a sort of a thing. I had lunch with my brother in Zurich not so long ago, and at the bottom end of the receipt, it simply said the words, "Your CO2 was compensated." And I was like, oh, yeah, good. They took care of that for me, because I was a little bit, you know, thinking about what's the sustainability of the restaurant, and they just took care of it. It went away. So absolutely surface it to the consumer, but somewhere in the value chain, somebody has to take responsibility.
So I think we've got a couple of connected questions here, actually. So I'm going to take this one first. There is an action intention gap within sustainability, basically showing that consumers are willing to be eco-conscious, but don't act. How do we tackle that? So there's one example there, Dan, where it was kind of done for them. But there's equally this, we talked about consumer education that needs to happen. I don't know if someone wants to expand on that slide. Steve, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's been a long trail, probably a history of environmental campaigns and sustainability campaigns that haven't landed with the consumer. You know, they know that it rates highly. I think it's, you know, in the top 3 choice across Europe. Climate change as being a real big fear and something they want to do something about. But then it ranks really, really low in terms of where their actions are. It's usually about health and family. I often use the air pollution analogy where about 10 or 15% of people cared about it when it was about particles in the air and very scientific. And then as soon as it became about people's health, you know, the kids and elderly, then 90% of the street cared and they started to really do something about it. So I think some of that action, say-do gap, as they call it, can often be in the presentation of how do you equate this thing that might seem far away or this thing that's not in my control to something that I could actually do something about. So I think labeling is coming, whether it's carbon, whether it's wider than that. Folks are looking to find out what they are buying, where it is made, who made it, what's in it. Just like, as we were talking about briefly before the panel, like calories sort of went on its own journey, where you started with a number, no one knew what it was. And then now we have all these other little things below, you know, fat, carbohydrates, and all these detail. And it's now simple language for us. And to say that you can know the calories, but you also need to know where the gym is as well. And so there's a number of different steps, I think, that the consumer probably has to get taken on.
Absolutely. So not only is there an education process, but it's trying to understand what they'll relate to and connecting with that to help them drive better choices. Okay, thank you. I think, so there's, oh gosh, jumping around. We've got a couple here which are about the payments chain. I think we've lost one off there. So I'll take this one at the bottom. How can you tell if your payment partners are actually driving sustainability or if they are greenwashing? I actually hear this quite a lot because there's often a discussion. We don't want to get into that because it might be seen as greenwashing. I don't know if anyone wants to pick this one up. Who's going to be brave enough to tackle greenwashing?
I'd be happy to have a crack at this one as well. I think it's the responsibility of the payments provider, which is providing this as a service, to offer absolute transparency and openness about a couple of things. First of all, exactly what are they doing? Exactly what projects are they working with? And exactly how are those projects implemented, certified, monitored, and verified? And even if they are, you see that some of these projects have flaws. It was in the news a few weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago, you probably saw the headlines that certain projects in the Amazon rainforest, these were called avoided deforestation projects, where basically a guy stands there with a chainsaw and says, pay me or I'll cut them down, which is, you know, for me, is absolutely awful. I think what you need to do there is look for a payments climate program which is very transparent about what projects they work with, even gives the consumer of that service the option to pick their own projects with plenty of transparency and guidance about what those projects are achieving. Look for one which has a portfolio approach as well, not just backing exactly one kind of project or vaguely saying we plant trees. Good? Happy? No? When you plant trees, are you doing this with a proper sort of multi-generational scheme? Is it afforestation? Is it planting native species? And you need some specialist knowledge to do that. And you need to work with people who are experts in the field to do that, to put together a climate program that really hits the spot and is really impactful and can be verified.
Yeah, I might just add that I think a lot of it's in the design right at the beginning. So often when we're doing products and services, you know, is it delivering value to the client? Is it delivering value to us? And is it delivering value to people and planet? I think if you're actually doing all 3 of those and looking for a meaningful change, then you're probably in good territory, so to speak, from a greenwashing perspective, because it's actually your intention to try and shift or change something out there in the world. And that's the added dimension to the business model that didn't exist before, but needs to be incorporated. And where I think, again, as I said before, is where the opportunity is.
From a merchant perspective, it's a little different because we're not in control of the product that's on offer, right? So we're watching regulation quite closely. And it's almost like a do not despair moment for Europe because we know it's coming, the CSRD. Whether you fall into the brackets or not, you probably have clients that are. So at some point, you're going to have to deliver this information. And the information awareness to the consumer and the merchant allows us to feel a little bit more comfortable that what we're getting is actually truthful, it's validated, it's backed up by science. And that's the case for the more regulated markets, but what we need now is to see that coming for the remainder of the markets.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got the most popular question at the top. I think, Steve, that's coming your way again. Are there any intentions from the schemes to incentivise sustainable behaviour in retailers and customers? I'm sorry, that is a pretty tough question.
I don't work for MasterCard, so I don't know. I guess I will say that and I should have said it before, is we're not seeing a decrease in spend here. We're seeing a shift in what the spend is. And so in so much that we can accelerate that, I think we'd be very happy to see how we can leverage everything that we've got to get behind that. And so whether it's better made material, more green, and such as organic foods, whether it's more local, less material use, the whole circular economy, all of those types of shifts in consumption are things that we're putting our efforts behind.
Okay, great. I think it's fair.
Maybe I can jump in on that from a merchant perspective as well. The word you mentioned before, cost, comes into play a little bit there, because in Dan's presentation I noticed the carbon offset option. It was available on a payment provider who I will not name again, but we associate it with a higher cost. So some things are more accessible, but when the cost comes with it, that cost has to be passed on to the consumer ultimately. So the consumer may be paying more for their product, not realizing that they're actually indirectly paying for the offset that they selected in the first place that felt cost-free at the time. So if this is truly going to be something that the merchant can drive without passing on to the consumer, then those incentives that are potentially an option for partners in the service chain should be really considered as something that can kickstart action on the merchant and consumer side.
It could be tied to loyalty, right? Something like that. Could you imagine a loyalty scheme where taking sustainable choices sort of doubles or triples the points that you earn because you've made a better choice? And that would really incentivize, first of all, the consumer to make that better choice, but even to come back to your business because you're doing something in the first place and you have this scheme.
Show plainly your credentials as a brand.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples we touched on before was around electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations. If you happen to have a physical location and you're a retailer, it counts in your scope 3 emission, whether someone drives a combustion car or EV car. So you put an EV charger outside. When you put an EV charger outside, you get people coming for longer. And you can do loyalty plays in order to get them to come into the shop in different ways. And so whether it's grocery stores, IKEA, a number of different stores are thinking about it like that. So I'm incenting a sustainable behavior. I'm meeting that customer group, and I'm finding a way to, make money from it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's mutually beneficial to think about how loyalty and sustainability can be connected. Okay, I think we've probably just got time for one more question. I'm going to take the one at the top, which is about if you're in a long value chain, how do you ensure that your whole chain is sustainable, or at least understand what the CO2 impacts are of your whole chain? This is a pretty tricky one. Anybody want to?
Well, I could start by saying it's a very difficult question to answer because, as we've established, it's part of the barriers to understanding this whole scope is the number of middlemen or different partners in the chain. So I think the question is out there as remaining to be answered, but we at least know that it must add something the more partners you add in the chain.
I think what we were talking about earlier as well with, just even having these discussions, starting to exchange ideas and best practices on initiatives, the more companies join in this, the better chance we've got of having a full value chain that's sustainable.
It's very hard to measure as well.
Incredible.
Especially, you could say something like, what if a scheme like Visa mandated that everyone in the chain using a Visa network had to disclose? But I don't know how practicable that is. And something else, paying with credit and debit cards through the schemes is not the only way to pay these days. There's also, embedded payments, paying directly through your bank account with open banking. And one that I was demonstrated this morning, Go Crypto, they have a point of sale where you can pay with bloody Bitcoin, right? And that's not going to go anywhere near Visa. That's going to go straight through something else. and is horrific for the environment in terms of the footprint of that particular transaction, that will probably be an order of magnitude higher than the 3.78 grams that I showed before. So what do you do about things like that? I don't think there is one sort of top-down solution that's going to solve that problem. It's up to participation and willingness to cooperate on this voluntarily to some extent as well.
I think going back to that hierarchy that you showed earlier, you know, if people at all levels were doing something, then it starts to chip away at the problem.
Yeah.
But the great thing about it is there are so many choices that there must be one out there that's better than all others from a sustainability perspective. So once we know what that one is, we can drive behavior towards it.
So INGKA could accept Bitcoin payments if they were willing to disclose the impact of that payment and surface it alongside other payments, so somebody might choose Visa instead.
As unlikely as it is that that would be the sustainable
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I think we can squeeze one more quick question in. So I think we've got, this one is kind of expanding on your point, Dan, about getting your own house in order. So how can you ensure your own sustainability in the payments value chain? Chris?
It's tough because, of course, the chain is big, but it comes back to getting your own house in order first. You're running a technology platform in one way or another. How is it coded? Where is it stored? What data providers and data centers do you work with? How can you reduce the chain? And a sort of topic there that I think Sam was alluding to is you've got a lot of choices out there. We've basically got the who's who of the payments chain here. There's nothing to stop you auditing everyone that's in your chain and starting with the weakest link and looking for a more sustainable alternative.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. Well, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your wisdom and insight on this issue. I really hope that everyone in the room has taken something away from this today. Please take points and learnings back to your companies, to your homes, and let's all see what we can do individually and within our companies to help drive the sustainability agenda. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you, Helen.